I grew up in a Christian home. Both of my parents were Christian. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles on both sides of the families, cousins were Christians. Uh, my parents are from the South, and it was the type of thing where on Sunday you were in church all day. And so I had a lot of exposure to God and to the Bible. And even though I'm sure I heard that God loved people, I still had the erroneous understanding that God was an angry God and that he was out to get you and he was just waiting for you to mess up so that he could punish you. I'm not sure, I'm sure I've heard some preaching that led me to that conclusion, and that overshadowed for me the concept of how loving God is. And so, as you might recall from one of the other stories I told, in my early 20s I spent a time of in just blatant rebellion against God and stopped going to church. And when I moved here to Indianapolis, because of a friend of mine, I started going back to church again. And I, would be in church and hearing sermons and would hear about the people of Israel, and I really just wanted to know what was that all about. Who was Israel? What was Israel? What was the story? And so I set out to read through the Bible on my own. And I'm so glad I did, because it totally changed my understanding of God's character. And I came to see for myself that God is a God of love, that he was so patient with people. He had a plan for them, a plan to make the people of Israel a mighty nation, and the whole world, because of Israel's relationship with him, they would see how good a God he was. And even though Israel was disobedient and they rebelled time and time again, countless times, God was always patient. He always forgave. Whenever they confessed, whenever they turned back, he would forgive them. And sometimes even when he punished them, it was always to turn them back to himself, so that the relationship could be restored. And I only came to that understanding after reading through the Old Testament on my own. People think that the God of the Old Testament, or First Testament as they taught us in seminary, is different than the God of the New Testament, but he's not. He's the same loving God, full of grace and full of mercy. But even though I was reading through that and came to that new understanding of God, there were some things that tripped me up. And I remember reading through the book of Leviticus, and not only can that be kind of dry material, if you will, because there's so much of the law code in there, I struggled with the punishment for some of the sins. So God required that for some sins in the Bible that people would be put to death by stoning. And I remember laying across my bed one day reading through the book of Leviticus and just coming across those passages that said, these people would be put to death for their sins. And I was just asking God, why would you do that? What if that were my brother? What if that were my mother? You really expect me to put them to death by stoning? I was just envisioning, you really want me to stone my mother to death? And I was asking God, why would you require that? And the room was silent, and I was just thinking and meditating and asking God. And then 3 words went through my head, and God answered my question. God said, I hate sin. And that's why he was requiring such a severe punishment for some of the sins that the people committed, because he hates sin. And this is such a foreign concept to people today, because we live in a world where you get to pick what you want to do, and sin is relative, and if it works for you, it's okay. No, God has certain requirements of us. He has a specific way he wants us to live. And there is such a thing as sin. When you live in a manner that goes against what God has asked of you, that is sinful. And God hates it. I sometimes think we don't fully understand the depths of God's hatred for sin. And I don't know, maybe it kind of gives a glimpse of just how magnificent the sacrifice Jesus Christ made was, because a person who had no sin took upon sin of the world, the sin that God hates. He took that on himself. and it led him to be separated from his father for a time. And that, even though it sounds brutal and horrific, that was an act of love for us on God's behalf, because he knew that that would restore forever the relationship that he has for us, for people who say yes to that free gift that he offers. It's interesting, I remember listening to a Bible study online called Discover the Word, and the lead teacher was Dr. Haddon Robinson. And one day they were talking about the fact that God required stoning as a penalty for some sins, or even in general that people be put to death. And they pointed out the fact that even though God required that, it wasn't often carried out. God didn't necessarily enforce that particular punishment. And it's just a reflection that God is gracious. It struck me in my own personal study that God required that severe punishment, but I missed the fact that it wasn't actually carried out. There are a few times in the Bible where it records people being stoned to death. But I think Dr. Haddon Robinson was right that God didn't actually force them to carry that out, because he's gracious. He's just simply gracious. His grace has always been there.